Hi, I'm Laurie Franks, founder and creative director here at Movida Sewing and Design Studios. Over the past 10 years, my focus has been teaching brand new sewers how to sew. I've been designing classes and patterns with those specific students in mind to make it so that the patterns can be current, they can be stylish, but they also can be easy to sew and put together. We keep that new sewist in mind every time we put something together. We have really young sewers in the studio, as young as 8, and we have students all the way up to 80 years old. We try and make the patterns as accessible as possible, and the way that we do that is we offer it currently in 11 sizes. So as small as maybe a child size 8, and then all the way up 11 sizes to maybe, I don't know what would be like an extra, extra large. But we also custom fit our patterns. We do that in class and in studio, but also for anybody who wants to buy our pattern online. You can choose one of the regular pattern sizes, or you can send us your measurements and we will send you a custom fit pattern. Super unique. We are going to make the hoodie today out of 100% organic cotton. So that's what this is. It's a sweatshirt fleece. So it's fleece on one side and cotton ribbing. The ribbing is matching, and that's what we have in the studio. And it is 95% cotton, 5% spandex. We also have the matching thread in the studio. If you're buying it, you need about 1.25 meters to 2 meters of fabric for the main body and 1/4 meter of the ribbing. So today we're going to be making our drop shoulder hoodie pattern, and I'm going to show you how to lay it out and use the pattern. But also to start, you're going to need a couple of tools to get started. So the first thing that we're going to need when we lay it out the pattern is you're going to need some pins. So these are my pins here. So just a bunch of pins. That's going to help us pin the fabric together so it doesn't shift, and it also might work to pin your pattern to your fabric. Other thing you're going to need is you're going to need some marking tools. So I have tailor's chalk here. This is a disappearing tailor's chalk, so it disappears with heat. And I also have a friction pen, and the same thing. Those are to trace around the pattern if you choose to cut the pattern out. So those are possibilities. You're going to need, of course, a pair of fabric scissors, so a nice sharp pair of fabric scissors, and possibly, depending on how you're going to use this pattern, you might need some paper scissors. Never the two shall cross, so don't use one for the other if you can help it. And then the last thing that you might want to use, and this is our bucket of weights. So these are fabric weights. They're just plumbing parts from the store, anything to weigh your paper pattern down on your fabric. Of course, today we've got our fabric here. I've got my matching thread, although my thread today is not matching because I want you guys to be able to see it, and our pattern. This is a copy of the pattern for Movida's Drop Shoulder Hoodie. When you order it from us, it comes in a package. It'll be printed out like this, or if you order it as a PDF, we'll send you the PDF, which you can have printed out, and the printout will look exactly like it is here. Unique to Movida's patterns is that the pattern is printed out exactly as you're going to lay it on the fabric. So there is no need to pre-cut all the pieces out and try and figure out how they're going to be laid out. This is specific to the fabric that you're going to use. The first piece, it's the main body. It says on the pattern it's the main body. The second one is the sleeve, the hood, and the front pocket. And then on the bottom of this one, there is a stencil just to show you how to cut out the neckline. So I'll show you how that works later. It's not a pattern piece, but a stencil. And the third one is for the ribbing. So that's the inside of the hat if you choose to do it as ribbing, the bottom ribbing piece, and the cuff. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this aside, and I'm going to show you exactly how to lay it out onto the fabric. So I've got my fabric here. It's 60-inch wide goods. That's how wide it is across. That's very typical for sweatshirt fabric, so I don't think no matter what sweatshirt fabric you choose, it always should be wide enough for your pattern. We are lining the fabric up pretty much as you would normally get it. So this is salvage to salvage, and our particular one has the wrong sides together. But it doesn't really make any difference when you're cutting it out if it's wrong sides or right sides, as long as the salvage is lined up there. You want it too thick so that you're going to cut your front and your back out at the same time as well. When you cut your sleeves out, you'll have 2. So everything you're going to cut out is of 2. So there's our fabric and our main body. So on your pattern piece, it has a grain line. It does not matter on this pattern if you're going to lay it this way or this way. It just makes a difference that the grain line is running parallel to the salvage, and that is the edge, the finished edge, or even parallel to the fold. So just like that, you're going to lay it out on the pattern just as it comes, grain line parallel to the edges. What I'm going to do is I am going to pin this on to the fabric, and then I'm just going to cut it straight out. If you're good and you don't want to use your fabric scissors to cut out your paper, which is usually what you don't want to do. You can pre-cut this out. You can cut the shape out and lay it down. I'm going to do it this way just because I'm trying to show you the easiest way to do this to make sure that you get it on the fabric just right. So we're going to lay it on like that. Make sure that that grain line is parallel to the edge. And then I'm just going to take some pins and I'm going to pin it on. And so that's through all the layers of the fabric and through the paper. And then I'm just going to straight out cut it out. So the way to use our scissors, if we're brand new, scissors have a bigger part here, smaller hole here, so it's your 3 or 4 fingers are going in the bottom. They're flat on one side, and we want to make sure that the scissors stay on the table and the fabric stays on the table. So we don't want to lift the fabric up or lift the scissors up. We want to keep both on the table. So you want to cut with the biggest opening that you can, and you can manage, and then come down, but not snip it to the end because that'll give you an uneven snip. So it's as big as you can, and then all the way down, and then slide open. Now I'm just cutting right through the paper and the fabric at the same time. Hopefully, as you can see, I'm keeping those scissors right laid down on the table and the fabric right down close to the table. Don't want to lift it up. If you lift it up, it distorts the fabric and distorts the way that the pattern is sitting on the fabric. So we're just going to go all the way around. You can spin your fabric around no matter what, as long as you're keeping it nice and tight to the table and that the pattern is down. This particular pattern is super forgiving, which means if you're not cutting it out exactly perfect for the first time out, if you're a new sewer, it doesn't really matter. We're trying to be as accurate as possible, but also give yourself a break. If it's not perfect, your sweatshirt's still going to turn out great. There is on this pattern 2 notches that you want to cut out, and that's here at the top and there at the bottom, and that's just going to help us mark where the center of the front and back neck is and the center of the bottom of the hem. So that's going to help us when we put our ribbing on. And you're just going to make a little snip about 1/2 centimeter. So there's our first one. We're going to now go on and get the next piece, and we're going to put the next piece on top and just continue on in exactly the same manner. In the sewing studio, we have really big tables, but when we're doing this demonstration for you, I wanted to use a smaller table just so you could see that you could do this at home on your kitchen table or on your desk. I've laid out the rest of the fabric here. This is our second piece. On this particular one, this one is the pocket on the front, and we're going to place this on the fold. So what I want on this one here is where it says place on fold and those arrows, I'm going to put that edge of the paper right up against the fold of the fabric. And again, you can see on here, there's our grain line running up and down here and our grain line running up and down for our sleeve. The patterns are also marked with instructions on them. So if you're not following this and you're just looking at the patterns also come fully instructed on what they're supposed to do and what each piece is. So again, I'm going to lay that out so that that is perfectly on the fold, and I'm going to pin it down and do exactly the same as I did for the other one. I'm going to cut all the way around all of the pieces. We've got the pattern here, and I've pinned it onto the fabric. All of the grain lines and all of the markings are on the pattern pieces. So if you've cut this out once before and it's not on the paper and you're looking to lay those pattern pieces down, follow the grain line. The grain line will run parallel to the selvage. This is particularly important when you're talking about a knit fabric because the knit fabric stretches across the fabric. So it means that when you put the pattern pieces on, the fabric is going to stretch across your body, not up and down. And so they all have to go the right way. You can imagine if you cut out one way and one the other way, you would be looking at perhaps the stretch of the fabric on the front going up and down. So as you wore the garment, it would get longer. And then if it went the other way across the back, it would get wider and it would make your pattern wonky. So all the pieces need to be cut out in the correct direction for success. If this was woven, it would matter a little bit less, but it's still, when you're sewing, follow your grain lines, make sure they run parallel. It's very important. I am now going to cut out with my paper scissors the template for the neck. So on our pattern, technically what you're going to do when you cut out the front and the back is you're cutting out the same pattern piece. That's just to make it easy. So we have the front and the back are the same. But the front neckline needs to drop lower. So this is going to be a template that you're gonna lay on your sweatshirt at the neck on one of the pieces, and that's going to transfer in from being a back piece into a front piece because we need the neck to be lower in the front than in the back. So we're just going to trace that onto our fabric. As you can see, when I've cut out, I've used my sewing scissors. Now, lots of people will say that it's not great to cut out paper with your sewing scissors, and that is true. But in the effort to make this perfect hoodie without fail, this is the way we've decided to lay out the pattern. But you can, as we said before, go ahead and cut your pattern pieces out first with your paper scissors, and we're going to do that in the next session, and I'll show you what that looks like. This is the third piece of paper that you'll have with the remaining pattern pieces on it. This is the interior hood. It is exactly the same as the exterior hood. We've just put it on a second time because you might want to cut it out of a different fabric. And so this will give you the opportunity to cut it out of a different fabric. This is the ribbing piece for the bottom of the shirt, and this is the cuff. So just to show you the different way of doing it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut these pieces out of the paper, and then I'm going to show you how you can pin them on the paper in the same way that we had done with the paper. So this way we'll save your scissors if you want to cut it out, or what it might be like if you're going to use the pattern again and again. Now I've got the three last pieces that we're going to cut out, and we're going to cut them out of ribbing. So I've got my ribbing fabric here. So this is the one that has the 5% spandex in it. It is the part that's really, really stretchy. It's got lines in it that run parallel to the selvage, and that makes it so that it's going to stretch this way. So again, all of the pattern pieces tell you exactly which way to lay them out on the fabric. So we're going to make sure that the grain line runs the same way as like the lines in it or the stretch in it. And this one here is the waistband, and it again says place on fold. So my fold is over here in the fabric, so I'm going to line it up with my fold, and this one's going to go over here, and I'm just going to line it up anywhere where they'll fit is just great. So we're going to stick them on like that. In this particular process, you can again pin these patterns in place. That's really typical to pin them in place. Or the way that we do it in the studio, which is way easier, I think, is we weight the patterns down so that they don't wiggle around on us. And then we use either tailor's chalk or a friction pen. So for this demonstration, I am going to use the friction pen because you're really going to see what I'm going to do. And so I'm going to trace around it after I put all the weights on, and then cut them out. There's our friction pen. These are felt tip pens. They work really easily. You're just going to guide them along. The marking doesn't have to be really dark. Once you move the pattern piece out of the way, you're really going to see it easily. I'm actually even going to butt this one up to here so that I don't have to cut it twice. How's that for being smooth? Like this. Okay, brilliant. Then what we're going to do is we're going to move these out of the way. And I'm going to use a few pins now just to put the fabric together. If I was doing this, just me, I wouldn't bother because I'm a fantastic cutter. But for new cutters, it's not a bad idea to do. It stops the fabric from shifting, right? Because you want the under piece of fabric to be exactly the same as the top layer. So sometimes when we're cutting, it can wiggle and shift around. So the more challenged you are at cutting, the more pins you want to put in. So if you're really wiggling that fabric around, or you're not steady, put a few more pins in. If you're pretty good at cutting, you can just put a few pins in. Sometimes your cutting skills are kind of dependent on how good your scissors are. So if your scissors are really sharp, you usually have an easier time. Sometimes challenging if you're left-handed, so you'll need a pair of left-handed scissors, which are tricky to use. Some people prefer rotary cutters. You can use a rotary cutter, but that requires a mat and a rotary cutter, and I just find scissors easier. I'm old school. Okay, so there she's all pinned on, and I'm just going to go ahead and cut this out now. I'm going to cut right on the line, or cut the line just slightly off. So either just on the inside of the line or right off. If I'm cutting on it and you see some of the black ink remaining, it doesn't really matter because the ink is removable by heat. So it means we just have to take it over to the iron and just even hover the iron over top of it, and the black line will disappear. Again, as you can see, the fabric is staying right flat on the table. My scissors never leave the table. They're always sliding along. You're probably best to try and do this standing up so you can get the leverage to press the scissors against the table, and that will help you get a nice sharp cut. Ta-da! So those are our cuffs, our hood, and our waistband. On all the patterns that we have, we put our QR codes on them. So I just wanted to show those to you. On the first one, if you use this QR code, this will take you directly to the YouTube video that you're watching, or you're potentially watching now, to use the QR code to watch the video or any one of our videos. And then you can use these ones to follow us on Facebook or follow us on Instagram. And we'd love it if you would follow us or tag us in your Instagram, Facebook, and watch our YouTube videos. Okay, so first things first, we have our body pieces. So there's two of them here. This is the pattern piece on it, so you can see what it looks like. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the pattern piece, and we're going to adjust the front neck guide. I'll show you how to do that. So first off, I'm just going to peel this pattern off. I'm going to take that away, and then right on this piece here, I'm going to take this pattern piece and I'm going to lay it on the neckline just like that. I'm then going to take my friction pen again, and I'm just going to hold this in place. If you want, you can pin it in place if you don't want it to wiggle, but it's pretty small. I'm just going to hold it into place, and then I'm just going to trace around it all the way around. Pretty simple. Okay, there you go. So it's going to look like that. Now I'm just cutting through one layer, okay? So there are two layers here. We've cut two. I'm going to peel this away, and I'm just going to cut that one layer. So I'm going to push that other piece away, and I'm just going to cut this front piece off. Get that a little bit better on that side. Okay, done. So now we've got our front piece here, and we have our back. First thing we're going to do to start the sewing process is we're going to pin and sew the shoulder seams across. So now we want the fabrics to go right sides together, which is pretty to pretty, or on this one with your fleece, it's the soft fleecy side on the outside, okay? So we're going to put them together. It doesn't really matter how they line up at the bottom. The key is to line up these shoulder seams, and we want them lined up perfectly. We want them lined up across the top edge here so they line up, and that they're lined up over here as well. And we're going to put about 4 or 5 pins in to make it sit. Okay, so we're just going to go in and out. For mine, I want the daisy pin, the head of the pin, to stay off. No matter what pins you're using, you want the pins to go in like this, perpendicular to the seam or across the seam. Okay, so we don't want to be pinning like this. And if you can help it, you don't want to pin upside down. Even if you just have a ball head pin, you don't want to pin this way. And the reason for that is because if you go to your sewing machine and you realize that you have to sew it from this way, or it's easier to sew it from this way, you can see that the other pins are missing. So you have to re-pin it, and you can't see where they are. But if you pin them perpendicular like this, then no matter which side you stitch from, you can always see your pin. So it makes no difference. It also gives a really good hold. And if you're pinning the opposite way, you can get poked with the pin. This way, there's no way that the pins are going to poke you. So there you go. That is the first one. Again, if I was sewing this, I would put less pins in. As we get to be speedier sewers, we need less and less pins, but you want to make sure that you're accurately lining this up. So the same thing on this side, I'm lining up the shoulder seams here. This time I'm going to use quilter's clips to clip it in place. Now these go on way faster than pins, but the other thing is that you have to stop and take them off as you're sewing. So the sewing time takes a little bit longer, the pinning time takes a little bit less. So it just depends on which way you want to sew. So there's both of your options. You've got your clips and then your pins, and we're going to sew across here at 5/8" inch, and then again across here at 5/8" inch. So right now we're going to sew across the top of the sweatshirt, across the shoulder line. Here we're going to sew it at 5/8. My sewing machine is set on a stitch 1, which allows me to run my fabric up against the edge of my needle plate, and I have a marking of 5/8. So make sure that that's what you're doing. It's really important that this turns out to be 5/8.
I'm doing a 2.5 stitch length that's preset on my sewing machine. That's a pretty good stitch length to complete this. We're going to back stitch at the beginning and the end of a line of stitching. And as I said, as we do these with the clips, I got to take them out. So I'm just going to set it in. I'm going to line her up. I'm going to put my presser foot down, needle down, and then I'm going to back up several stitches so I get my good back stitches right pretty close to the edge of the fabric. Oh yeah, and I'm using a dark color pink thread so you can see what I'm doing. But when you're doing it, we're going to make sure that you have the best match that you possibly can. You want it to be invisible if possible. And we're just going to shoot this through, okay, 5/8. Perfect. So there you can see how much more time it takes. Quicker to put them in, harder to sew with the clips in. I'm going to do the second side now. We've got our pins in. I'm going to do exactly the same. I'm going to line it up to the 5/8. I'm going to press my presser foot down. I'm putting my needle down. I'm doing several stitches backwards to lock it in, back tacks. And this time I'm just going to sew right across. And my back tack. And mine has a cutter on it, so there I'm cutting my threads. And there we go. Perfect. I've done my 5/8 seam allowance. The next thing we're going to do on this is we're going to sew a zigzag stitch. This is my preferred way to do it because the fabric does have some stretch and that top shoulder seam is the most important. We are going to run a zigzag stitch right across the top here where the part of the zigzag that comes over is actually going to just touch this line or almost come to it. It means that I'm again going to line this up at 5/8, and when I do my stitch, it's going to go back and forth. This is going to give it some ability that if the fabric is stretched, that if this seam was to pop out for any reason, you've got some extra reinforcements there. So on my sewing machine, I set it at a 5. That gives me my zigzag stitch, and I'm going to do a fairly big zigzag. So this is a preset on my machine, and I'm just going to make it slightly bigger than the preset, and I'll show you what that looks like. And again, I'm going to line it up to the 5/8. And I'm just going to zip all the way across, making that stitch just hit that line. I'm going to hold it up and show it to you. So it's just shy of the line. So if that stitch was to pop, then the reinforcement of the zigzag would take over and you wouldn't see anything. So I'm just going to put this one through and do exactly the same thing again. Beautiful, right? Zigzag all the way across. So then the final step on this is we're going to do a top stitch. Now this is mostly just for aesthetics, but it also will act as a reinforcement stitch. So we're going to open it up now. We're going to stitch just like it says from the top down. So a top stitch. We also want the seam allowances to go towards the back of the shirt. So we know now that this lower part is the front. So we want to push all the seam allowances towards the back of the shirt. And then we're going to flip it over. So the seam allowances are going to the back, and we are going to stitch right here about 1/4 inch approximately across here. We want to choose a top stitch the same width everywhere on our garment. So we're going to top stitch about 3 or 4 different spots. So figure out exactly on your machine where it's going to be comfortable for you to line it up. I'm pinning the seam allowance over to one side. That's just so that it doesn't flip over on me. So I'm going to pin that just so all the seam allowances, as you can see, are headed that way, which is to the back of the garment. For me, when I stitch it, I'm going to stitch it from this way. So now the back is on this side because I'm going to use the edge of my foot as the guide along the crack. So at the studio here, we call this toe to crack, which means that we're going to line up the toe of the sewing machine to the crack on the machine. I'm going to reset my sewing machine back to my straight stitch. So I'm just going to use a regular straight stitch. You can, at this point, make the top stitch slightly longer. It makes it look a little bit nicer. So I am going to go up to a 3 on my top stitch. I'm going to use the edge of my presser foot as the guide, and I'm going to put that to the crack. When I'm sewing this one too, when I go through, I kind of want to pull the fabric apart. I don't want the fabric to roll over on itself. I want a nice straight seam. So as I sew, I'm going to kind of go like this and pull the fabric apart slightly as I go across. So here we go. Needle down, 2 stitches backwards, and then we're going to sew across. So there you go. There's our top stitch. Pretty good. As I said, when you do it, your fabric and your threads are going to match, so it's going to be less defining. It's just going to be a stitch line, so you won't see it as much. It's also really important when you're doing all of these, because the fabric is stretchy, that you don't stretch the fabric as you go through. So when I'm saying I'm pulling it taut, I just want it taut. I don't really want to stretch it, and I definitely don't want to stretch it this way. So make sure that it's going through the sewing machine, that you're not pulling on it or anything. You're going to use really gentle fingers. You're just going to let the machine pull it through just the way that it wants to, not pushing or pulling, because then we don't want to stretch the fabric. And again, I pinned it on the first time. You absolutely can pin it. Second time out, didn't bother. Back stitch, cut it off. And there you go. There's your shoulder seam, your top stitch on it. Our next step in making our hoodie is we're going to attach the sleeve. So I have the bodice of the hoodie right here, and we've done our shoulder seam and top stitch it. And so now we're going to add the sleeve. So what we're going to do is I'm going to open the garment up, and I'm going to put it flat on my work surface with the pretty side up. I have my sleeve pieces right here. It's got the pattern on it. I'm going to take the pattern pieces off, and I'm going to show you how we're going to line it up. Our sleeve, to make it simple, is exactly the same on the front part of the sleeve as on the back part of the sleeve. Very many times when you make a sleeve, there is a difference in the front sleeve and the back sleeve to accommodate the shoulder, but because this is a slouch shoulder and because it's a beginner pattern, it doesn't really make any difference which way you put it on. Okay, on the pattern as well, we have made a little notch at the top, and so we've done a little cut, and that little cut is going to line up with the top of the shoulder seam. So we're going to take the sleeve now, doesn't matter which one, and we're going to lay it down on top of the sweatshirt front and back, and we're doing right sides together. So that's the fuzzy side up or the right side together. So I always say like jam in the middle, right? And all the good stuff is in the middle. So good stuff's in the middle, because we're always going to sew inside out and then flip it right side out. We're going to line up that little snip that we have on the top to the top of the sleeve where the seam is. So not where the top stitch is, but where the actual seam is. And we're going to bring that together, and we're going to line it up, and we're going to pin it in place. You can use both clips and or pins for this, but I way prefer the pins at this point, because we are going to sew a curve, and we're sewing two curves together. And I always like make it like this. The curves are going like this because the sleeve's got to change direction. So we got to make them fit together. So I'll show you, if you can see here, this curve goes like this and this curve goes like this, and we have to make them fit together. So if you're using pins, we can put more pins together, but also you can sew right up to the pins or over the pins when you're sewing. When you have to take the clips out, sometimes the fabric can shift a little bit. So we're going to try and make it match. So my way of doing it is pinning it at the top here, and then we want to make sure it fits. So we're just going to come all the way around to the side or under the armpit. That's where we are here, armpit or the edge of the seam. And we're going to line that up as well. And we're going to pin that. And so then we're going to pin those seams together. They should fit, but if you can see, this one's going to want to pull this way, that one's going to pull that way, and we're just going to make them fit because we are trying to get two curves to come together. And so I am going to do, and I call this pinning in outer space. Instead of trying to pin it here on the table flat, which you can do, it's a little bit more tricky, easier to just to hold it up and run your fingers across and just line up the edges and then just pin it across. Both of the fabrics have a little bit of stretch in them, so you want to not take advantage of that stretch and stretch one or the other, but it also can add a little bit of ease to make it go in easier. That stretch you can work to your advantage. Around this curve at the bottom, I'm going to put my pins a little bit closer together to make sure that they stay in place. And then where the curve is a little more subtle, I don't have to do as many pins. When we're starting with really young or new sewers, what we do is we have them sew from the top of the shoulder down and do that part first, and then go from here and down here, because sometimes changing that direction or keeping that direction over the top of the shoulder is challenging. So if you're really brand new sewers, you can now go and sew it, and I'll turn it around so you can see what I'm talking about, from the top of the shoulder down if you're having trouble making the curve. If you're a little bit more confident, you can do both sides and go right around the curve. So I am going to pin both sides and show you how to go right around the curve. So I've just pinned one side. I'm going to come back to the second side. I'm going to pin that under armpit part together, line those up first and put a pin in it. And then, as I said, I'm going to go from the top center usually and just slide it along, sort of what I call, as I said, out in outer space up here in my hands, and just line those up. It stops the fabric when you're going this way from like catching on each other when they're flat, so the fabric can be a little bit easier to manipulate. And we're going to put about 1 finger apart or 2 fingers apart as we go through this curve. If you're finding that the fabric is puckering a lot or you're not getting it in there smoothly, just sort of repin and move the fabric around. So you might find that for some reason, and they should fit perfectly, that your sleeve is looking like a little bit baggy down here. You can just sort of shift the fabric up and make sure that it's going in evenly. You definitely don't want any puckers, which means you don't want the fabric to fold over in any place, to come over on itself. It should fit flat, even though you can see on this side how it's kind of wrinkly here, and that's because of the curve. So that's totally normal, but where you're sewing, you want to make sure that goes in flat. One of the other things to note is that when we're sewing it and we're going to put it in the sewing machine and we're going to sew it like this at 5/8, this part of the fabric is going to want to come up like this. And we see that time and time again, is that the students put it in like this, and then this part of the sleeve wants to pucker up underneath, and we find them sewing it like that. So when you're sewing this in, you want to make sure, as a way we always sew, is you're going to put it in the sewing machine, you're going to put your needle down, you're going to do 2 stitches backwards, and you're going to sew at 5/8, and you're going to sew the distance of the plate on your sewing machine. So we call that like the deck of your sewing machine. It's like 6 inches. So you're going to make sure that looks all perfect. You're going to hold your hand there, you're going to put it through, and then you're going to stop, and then you're going to make sure that the next 6 inches is perfect. You're going to put your hand underneath, make sure all the other fabric is not in the way, and then you'll sew another like 6 inches or the distance of the plate of your machine, so you know that it's perfect. You're going to stop again, and then you're going to pull this around and make sure that it's out of the way, because this fabric is going to be all over the map, because it's, again, half the fabric is going this way and your sleeve is going in this way. So there's no way to make it lie flat. You've just got to make sure that when you're sewing that seam, that nothing else is tucking up underneath it. So that's what she looks like. Okay, so now we're going to sew our sleeve in. I find the easiest way to go is have the sleeve on the back side and have the shirt part on the front, but it doesn't really make any difference. And you're going to have some wrinkles here, and we definitely don't want to sew those down. So we're going to be sewing at 5/8. I'm going to put it into my sewing machine. I'm going to put it in over about maybe 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter from the start. I'm lining it up to my 5/8. I'm dropping my needle down. I'm doing my 2 back or 3 back tack stitches, and then I'm just going to go all the way along, making sure that she lines up. Again, making sure that the fabric is not riding up behind. I'm going to make sure, and I'm going to sew, like as I said, almost what fabric is on the deck of my sewing machine. So I'm going to go across, and then I'm going to stop again. I'm going to make sure that the fabric is not riding up from behind, that it looks all good, that the seams are all lined up to about the edge of my deck of my sewing machine. And again, I will continue across. My back tack stitch, and then my cutter. And there you go. Brilliant. All the way around, and no tucks, pleats, or puckers on the other side. I'm going to go ahead and do the other one. Okay, so the next step we're going to take is we're going to top stitch around the armhole. So what I want you to do is move all of your seam allowance towards the body of the garment so that all of the seams are going this way. There's my sleeve, as you can see it laid out, going this way. And just like our other top stitch, we're going to top stitch at about 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch here, the same as we did across the shoulder. And once again, once you get really good at this, you can just sew it and feel that the seam is going that way. But for this purpose, what I want you to do is we're going to pin it in place. So you're going to put your pin in and out of the seam allowance that you can feel from the back side. So I hope you can see that. There's our seam allowance. We're pinning through this. So you're going to put your pin in just on the body side of the seam that we've sewn, the line, and then back up again, catching the seam allowance. So you want to do quite a little bit of pinning. That will give you the best effectiveness of keeping that seam allowance where it's supposed to be. If you push the pin in too far over and you miss it, the seam allowance can curl back over on you if you're not careful. So we really want to make sure that it's sitting on this side, the whole point of it. And you'll really notice if you miss it, because this is going to create kind of like a fat seam because there's a lot of fabric there. And if the fabric's not there, it will seem kind of bumpy on you. So we're going to pin this. When you're pinning it, you want to pull the fabrics apart a little bit because you want this seam to be tight. You definitely don't want the fabric overlapping this way or that way and creating like a bulgy bit. So I am pulling the seam a bit taut, and when I sew it, I'm going to do the same thing. I want to pull that seam taut.
Also because I've sewn it perfectly straight, if I then let it bubble over on one side or the other side, then it's going to create like a non-straight seam. And after I've sewn it perfectly straight, I want to make sure that I maintain that visual of having a nice perfect straight seam. Boop. We're going to keep it on that side. So again, we're going to sew down here just on the body of the garment, catching all the seam allowances in our top stitch. Okay, so that's one sleeve, and I'm going to flip it around and do the other side. Okay, so now I'm going to do my top stitch around my sleeve. I do have the bulk of my garment on the right hand side, which looks a little bit backwards, but it's not really, because I am using the edge of my presser foot as the guide against my seam allowance. So I want to be able to sew right here with the seam allowance with the guide of my foot right there. So that's why this time unusually the bulk of the fabric is there. I want all of my seam allowances headed as I pinned it towards the body of the jacket. And as I sew, what I want to do is I want to pull the fabric apart slightly as we're pushing through, and I don't want to inhibit how fast it goes through. So I want to be really conscientious not to, as I'm pulling it apart, to stop it from going through in any way. So the pulling is a little bit like this way and a little bit out, because as long as we keep it going through at a good pace, we'll get the stitch lengths. It won't interfere with how long the stitch lengths are. If you end up holding it down and not letting it move through at its natural pace, then your stitches are going to be too tight together. And if you push it through, it's going to make those stitches look longer, and we want a really consistent sleeve. So we're just going to try and pull it apart. Oh yeah, and again, we are on 3.5 because we are doing the top stitch length. If you can remember to make it go up a little bit higher, it looks nicer. And again, on my machine, I'm using the edge of my presser foot as my guide to give me a top stitch that's consistent with the top of the sleeve, as well as when I put my pocket on. So here we go, needle down, we're going to do our back stitch, and then again, as nicely as we can. Pull it out, and there you go. There's your top stitch. I did pretty good at matching the width here and the width there. This is our pocket, and I'm showing you with the pattern piece on, so it's pattern piece C. We are now going to get it prepped up for sewing. So we're going to just take the pins out of this, and we're going to prep up the sides of the pocket, so where your hands go in, because that's the first thing you have to do. So again, we're going to open this up. We want fluffy side up, or the wrong side of the fabric up. There's a little jaggedy edge here, and we are going to fold this in 3/4 of an inch so that this part down here lines up smoothly with that part there. And we are then going to pin it in place. Let's get there. Now, because this is cut across angle, sometimes it's hard to get it perfectly straight, as it were. I'm good at it, but anyway. So what I'm going to show you on the other side is how you can mark it. So you can take your ruler, and you are going to mark it on the outside of the fabric. Sorry, on the right side of the fabric, and you're going to mark it straight across so that it's a straight line, and it is 3/4 of an inch. So we're going to go like this, and we're just going to mark a straight line across that, and then we're going to flip it over and use that mark as a guide so that it will be perfectly straight. And this time again, I'm going to use the clips on this side just to show you. When we sew this down, we're going to sew really close to the edge of the fabric, that raw edge. So not close to the fold, but close to the raw edge. I'm going to use that black line as a guide to make sure that it's perfectly straight. Ta-da! Like so. And then we're going to stitch down there to start off. Okay, so we got the pocket here, and what we're doing is we're going to sew down these two parts, and these are the parts where your hand goes in, right? And then we're going to attach it to the body. So we're just pre-finishing these off. So the way that this is done, it's a little bit different, is that you're going to set this in, and you want to sew as close to the raw edge here as you can. So on my sewing machine, the easiest way for me to do that is I take the small edge of the presser foot, or what you're doing is you're lining it up, so you're going to be about 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch there. So mine is the small edge of the presser foot, so I'm just going to line that up with the raw edge of the fabric. And then I'm going to try and keep it straight and go all the way down. So I'm going to go needle down, 2 stitches backwards, and then I'm going to come straight up. So this time I'm watching this edge rather than lining it up over here. And then I'm just going to add in at the top
You are going to run out of fabric before you get to the top edge of the fabric. What I want you to do when you're sewing is I want you to just run off that and go onto the single layer. I want you to do your stay stitch or your back stitch at the very end. So I'm just going to come straight off of that, and then I'm going to do my back stitch way over here. And I'll show you what that looks like. So there's the edge of my fabric. I want to come all the way that way because later when we finish it, I just want the end of the fabric to be tucked in. So that's our look, is we're just going to come right off the end of it. So that's what that looks like. I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Oh, what a good sewer I am. Look, perfection down both sides. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to put our pocket on the front of our hoodie. So we're going to take our hoodie and make sure that we know which one is the front. I'm going to do that by holding it up by the shoulders and figuring out the back of the jacket is the one where we've top stitched it back towards, and the front, of course, has a lower dip because we've cut the lower part. So we're going to put this pocket right on the front. We want to make sure it's centered, and you certainly can use a ruler to center it. And we've actually made a snip where the center of the front is, so that's there. But if you've missed that, all you want to do is just fold it in half, go like that, and make sure you've got the center of the front of the jacket. But we did mark that earlier. And then we've got our pocket or our pouch, and the same thing. We want to figure out where the center of it is at the bottom. So all I'm going to do is just do a quick fold in half and find the center. And I'm just going to mark it with a pin just to start with. And now this time we're going to do wrong sides to the right side, right? Because we're not going to flip this inside out. We want this to sit on here so it looks like this. So all I'm going to do, let's get the back out of the way so we're not going to pin it to both sides. I'm going to lay it down like this. I'm going to get that little snip. I'm going to line my pin up so it looks perfect. And we're going to line this up right to the bottom edge of the hoodie. So now what we're going to do is we're going to fold these under 5/8 and this under 5/8 and the top 5/8 as well. So making sure that these fold under 5/8 and 5/8 and across the top evenly is pretty important so that your garment looks even. So I'm going to give you the easiest way to do that. So now that we've sort of got it pinned on, I know where it's going to go. I'm going to flip this back like this, and I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to make a mark at 1 1/4 inches in. So 1 1/4 inch in, looks like that. And then I'm going to take my friction pen and I'm going to draw a line across it like so. Then I'm going to fold to the line. And I am going to secure this with a couple of clips here and here. So I've secured it up to the fold line. So that's going to be 5/8. And then I'm just going to flip it back down onto the hoodie. And then I'm going to pin it in place. I'm going to use my pins now and I'm going to mark it in place. So I'm just going to put some more pins in, get it down. When we stitch this down, we're going to use a top stitch. I can take these clips out. We're going to do a top stitch and we're going to sew right at about 1/4 or 1/8 of an inch across. Hopefully the same measurement as you did on your sleeve top. So wherever that marking was for your sleeve, you're going to try and make it the same along here. There's no need to sew across here because when we add to the band, you're going to sew that together. But we're going to do this side and this side. So again, I'm going to flip this over. I'm going to mark it at 1 1/4 inches like so. And I'm going to fold that up and then I'm going to clip it in place. Then when it's clipped in place, I'm going to flip it over and then pin it in place. Now, once you get really good at this, you can probably flip it and fold it without marking it. You'll know where 5/8 is. And we're going to try and make sure that this is really straight along there. So because the fabric it's got some give to it, you don't want to make sure that it's not curved, and you're sort of eyeballing it to make sure that both of these sides line up. So the same thing across the top. I'm going to mark it at 1 1/4 inches down. It's 1 1/4 because that's 2 times 5/8, if that makes sense. So when you fold it up, you're going to get that 5/8. Folding it in place. And of course, if you don't have the clips, you can just pin it, and then you're going to take the pins out and add more pins as you pin it to the front of the hoodie. You can also press this. So if that's easier for you, if you've got an iron, you can press this down. Although knits don't always love the iron. So sometimes they're a little bit harder to iron down. So there you go. I've got it all in at 5/8. I'm just going to flip that up, make sure she looks beautiful, and then I'm going to pin it down into place.
I would say that this is one of the most important things that we're going to do on the hoodie today because it's right in front. And so if you can get it on nicely and get your pocket looking beautiful, then that's going to really show off some of your expertise. If it goes on wonky or a little bit crooked, then you're going to need a little bit more practice. So you want to take a little extra care and make sure that this goes on nicely. I'm going to take those clips out. I would put quite a few pins in across the top. You really want to get that line looking nice and straight. So you want to make sure that it doesn't wiggle and move and that you really do have that 5/8 turnover on it. Perfect. And I'm going to sew right across there. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're sewing on the pocket. I am going to do that top stitch right here, back and forth. This part's going to be covered up by the band, like in the seam allowance. So I'm not too worried about making this pretty, but this is going to be like really visual and you have to do your back stitches. So you want to try and make that really pretty. So when we get there, I'm going to really slow down. I'm going to go slow. I'm trying not to drop off the end of the pocket. I'm trying to hit it on the pocket and then back up. But you also want to make sure that's really secure because that's where your hand's going to go in and you don't want that popping up or the stitches popping out. Okay, so I'm going to go like not too fast across here, but when I get here, I'm going to go really slowly. Okay, so I'm going to drop her down, it's needle down, my 2 stitches back, and then I'm coming up here. Oh, sorry. One thing I forgot and we got to do is we're going to make our stitch length a top stitch length. So I'm going to put it up to 3.5 instead of my regular 2.5 stitch. It's going to give us a little bit longer stitch and it looks nicer from the outside. So if you remember to do that, just turn it up, same as you did on your shoulder seam. And then cut. So, because I'm the fancy professional, I did a really nice job. You can see that I've lined it up here and I've done 3 and you can't really see it. But even in my professional way, this is not super straight. It's a bit tricky to get straight, but your stitching's going to match and it's going to look pretty good. I mean, it's not bad. Okay, so now I'm going to do the same right across the top. I'm just going to spin it around. This one, the same thing. I'm going to start in a little bit from the edge and then I am going to needle down, I'm going to back stitch and then I'm going to come forward, but I am going to try and get right to the edge of the fabric without dropping off the pocket. So needle down. And we're coming to the end again. So I'm going to go pretty slow. Oh, that's the end. Back it up. And then I'm going to come forward 1 or 2 more. Brilliant. And there we go. Sewn all the way across the top. So you do want to get it pretty nice and close as you can. So I've done not a bad job. If you go too far over, what's going to happen is that this is going to curl down on you and it's not going to look nice. You're going to get like your lunch and crumbs all stuck in there. So you are trying to go quite close to the edge and go as straight as you possibly can. Okay, and then we'll just do the last one. Okay, so we're doing super great putting our lovely hoodie together. This is what it looks like so far. We got our pocket on, shoulder seam, sleeves in. So the next order of business is we're going to sew the sleeve and the side seam. So we're going to line it up from here and we're going to sew down here and over here. And I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to do that for the best success. We're looking pretty cute so far. So we have it right side out. So same as always, we're going to flip it inside out. So I'm going to flip it around so that the garment is inside out. There we go, inside out. And I'm going to lay it out so I can show you. We are going to start at the armpit. Okay, so there goes our sleeve, like so. And that goes down the front. And this is our armpit. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to pin that together. And we're going to line them up and put a pin. I would use pins for this part right around here because I really want it to be secure. It looks really nice when those seams line up in a perfect cross. If you get them off, then it looks, you know, a little bit more homemade, which is not that we're trying to hide that we made it, but you want to make it look like you know what you're doing. So we're going to line it up like that. Because you've top stitched your seams, we are not going to be butterflying them. They are going to all be headed down towards the garment. So it is a little bit bulky here, but it shouldn't really cause any issues. And then we are going to line up the bottom of the sleeve where the cuff will go on and the arms along here like so. And they should line up perfectly like that. And we're going to put a couple of pins in. Again, this is a straightaway line. So for here, if you wanted to, you absolutely could use those clips again if you want to. I'm just putting pins on this side. Again, every 3 or 4 fingers. I'm doing every 4 fingers. And we're going to line this up. This is trued. At the bottom of your sleeve, it's trued a little bit, which means it comes down and it kicks back out again. And the reason for that is that when we sew the cuff on, we wanted this to be on the straight, not to come down on an angle. So we straightened out the seam allowance. It just makes putting that cuff on, when we put it on, your ribbed cuff on, a little bit easier. Okay, so there's pin. So that is from armpit to cuff. And then we are going to pin armpit to the hem or the bottom of the bodice. And I'm going to put that together first to make sure that it lines up. It should line up perfectly. One of the reasons that it might not line up is that if you weren't very accurate in sewing your arm on and you sewed maybe at this side a little bit further than 5/8 and this side a little bit less than 5/8, then what you'll have is that these seams won't be the same. And so it might not line up perfectly, but you are definitely trying to make it. And if it is off a little bit, do try and line up those seams as best as you can. And then just kind of snudgy the fabric around a little bit, like pull it a little bit, as long as it's only a little bit, and try and make it fit so that that lines up there. If you're finding that one side is way longer than the other, you might have to go back and relook at that sleeve. You don't want to pull it a lot. So if it was out by an inch, you don't want to stretch it down because it'll want to come back up on itself and it's going to create ripples. And it's also going to get the fabric to kind of twist on you. So you're definitely looking, if it's just like a little bit out, then you can definitely give it a little pull. But if it's way out, you're going to want to have to fix that bit there. If you trim it off at the bottom, it's not the best idea either because you are going to kind of see it when you put your ribbing on or the way your jacket sits, and it's going to pull up a little bit. So best is that you try to get that as straight as possible or as even as possible, and that your sleeves come in. My suggestion is, when you're doing this, is to start here at the seam. And what I like to do is I like to start about an inch over from this seam, and I'm going to head to the sleeve. So I'm going to start here and I'm going to go down to the bottom, and then I'm going to go back, and on this time I'm going to start an inch over at this side, and I'm going to come down across here. The reason we want to do that is if we start here and we go, and for some reason the fabric shifts on you, there's no way you're going to get that lined up, or you could end up with like a pucker up near the sleeve. So if this fabric's shifting, you're going to get a pucker up here. You're better off, if it's going to move on you, that you're going to be a little bit out at this side rather than creating puckers here. And then the same thing here, if you're coming from the armpit down to the bottom, then you can make sure that it's going to lay flat. If you come this way and you end up with a little bit of extra fabric, you could end up again with a bump or a pucker under the armpit, which is not great. And by starting here and starting here, it's easier because you don't really want to start your stitching on all that bulk of the seam allowance, but then it also gives you double stitching through the armpit, which is where it gets the most tension when you're putting your jacket on. So that double sleeve. The best thing is you're trying to overlap them when you come here. So that thing is, you don't want to miss it by a half an inch, and then it's going to be really weird. You are going to try, and when you do that double, is to stitch right at the same spot. So we are now going to sew our sleeve and our bodice. I'm going to make sure that I switch back. If you have been in your top stitch, we're going to sew this at 2.5 stitch length. And again, I'm going to start at the armpit, and I'm going to start about an inch up from the seam. So I'm going to put her in like this. I'm sewing it at 5/8. I'm going to line it up to my 5/8 line, and I'm going to start on that side of the seam, and I'm going to sew from the armpit down to the bottom. There's a bit of a curve here, as you can see coming down. Don't really want to stretch out the curve. You actually want to steer it through on the curve. So needle down, a couple of stitches backwards to lock my stitches in, and then we're going to come down. There we go, armpit down, and now we're going to sew from here down. Now this is another reason why it's really nice to put your pins in this way, because in order for me to sew down from this side, I am going to flip my fabric over. I'm going to sew from the other side, so it makes no difference because my pins are there. If you had put your pins in lengthwise, you'd be coming here and having some trouble. One of the other things that I wanted to point out while I am sewing this, we're going to start on this side of the seam. We're going to line it up so that I'm going right over top of exactly where I want to be. I'm going to needle down, make sure I'm landing in the stitch line, 2 stitches backwards, and then I'm going to come all the way down this way. What I was going to say was, as you can see from me sewing, I do not have my hands all the way up here. See lots of sewers with their hands up here trying to control the fabric with their fingers up here, way too close to the needle and way too close to what they're doing. You don't need to have your hands that close. I am often having a hand over here and a hand down here holding my fabrics, or somewhere in this vicinity. I do not need them up here. The only time that I might be going way up here is if I was going around a really difficult corner, and then I would be going very, very slowly with my hands up. But I don't need my fingers up near the needle or the presser foot. I am more concerned that the fabric is going through evenly, that my fabric's not bunching up. This hand is on the fabric really lightly, so I'm not stopping or managing the speed with my hands or my fingers. Many sewers too tend to have a hand back here, and so that way it's not the best habit. For one of the reasons, if your hand is back here, you're leaning over your machine, so you tend to be crouched over, but also you can't steer anything from back here. It's already going through. It's like trying to steer from the back end. We're trying to steer from the front and send the fabric through nice and straight. So from the back side, it has no value. And there we go. We're sewn all the way up the sides. Beautiful. And I'm going to go and do the same on the other side. We're on piece number D, which is the hood part. I'm going to show you how to do it. So there is our original piece that we cut out from the paper. This is the exterior part of the hood. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to sew the crown. So that's the top part of the hood. We're going to sew around like this. This part here is the neckline. So that's going to be sewn to the body of the hoodie. And this is the front opening where our face comes out. So we're going to finish that differently. But these two, this around the crown is going to go first. We're taking our pattern off. Again, I'm flipping this around because our fabric came with the pretty side out and we want the pretty side in. So we've got that fuzzy, fleecy part on the outside. I'm going to line these up so that they line up perfectly. The better you line them up, the easier it is to get them to sew. So there we go. And again, we're going to put our pins in. We're going to put them in and then out with the daisy or the ball or whatever you have on the end. Make sure that they're nicely lined up. As your skills get better, you can put less pins in. My suggestion is every 3 or 4 fingers, and maybe a little bit less as you're going around a curve. So something like this. And all the way around. This is going to make the sewing really easy. Always like one right near the end. Make sure that it's all lined up. Blammo. There. This one is the ribbing one, so you may be using the same fabric for inside and out, but we've chosen the ribbing. We want to make sure that we are right sides together. The outside is the right side, so again, I'm just going to flip it around so our right sides are on the inside. Put them together. And again, we are going to sew around the crown of this. And on this time, again, faster to put the clips in if you're using clips to put them in, but slower in the sewing as you have to stop every single time you get to a clip and pull it out. So just depends on which part you're happier with, where your speed is, and of course, which materials you have. There we go. Okay, so now I'm going to sew my hood. I'm starting with the interior. It doesn't really make any difference which one you start with. And we're going to just sew where we've clipped all the way around at 5/8 of an inch. You're going to go a little bit slower. You got a curve. You're a new sewer. So we're going to stick it in and we're going to line it up once again at 5/8. I'm using my regular stitch length, which is 2.5. And I'm going to set it in here. I'm going to line it up with a 2.5. I'm dropping my needle. I'm doing several stitches backwards. And I'm going to go all the way around at 5/8. Ta-da! All the way around. Looks good. I'm going to do the other one now, which is the outside layer, the fleece layer. This is the one that I pinned. Same thing. I'm just going all the way around the crown at 5/8. As I said, if you're a newer sewer, you're going to go a little bit slower than I'm going. You're going to try and keep it as smooth as possible. Ta-da! Together now, I've got the 2 hood pieces here. This is the outside piece, this is the fleece, and this is the lining, and we're using our pink ribbing for the lining. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna sew up this part and put the two hoods together that way. And so that is that part there, so the straight edge. So what we want is we want to once again put right sides together. So this is my outside hood. I'm going to take the inside hood and I'm going to turn it around so it goes like this. So we now have the outside here, and I am going to fit it in to the other hood like this. So as you can see, it fits together perfectly, and now I have, there's the inside and there is the outside hood. This is the top center seam that's like right here. We are going to open that up and lay it flat. It's called butterflying. It helps you line up those two seams in the front so that you can see them. It also makes it less bulky to sew over. So you're just going to open that seam up and open that seam up and make sure that the seam lines line up nicely. And then I'm going to put a pin in both sides of this so that the seam allowances will stay flat when I sew over it. Now, this one's quite easy. This is a straight line. I mean, I know that it goes this way, but the sewing is a straight line. So in this case, if you wanted to put some clips in, you totally can. I'm going to line up the bottom edge here, and I'm going to put a pin in it because I really want to make sure it's secure and it's not going to shift. And I'm going to put another pin in it down here. If I was sewing this because I'm fancy, that's all I would put in as far as pins. So as you get to be a better sewer, less pins is of course faster, both for construction and for sewing. But for a new sewer, you want to make sure that those two edges between the outside and the back line up perfectly. So I am going to use just a couple of clips, which is my suggestion, or again, if you're just using pins, put them in. Because it's a straight edge, every 3 or 4 fingers apart would probably be about what you'd want to do, and making sure those two line up. One fabric is stretchier than the other, so you want to be aware that you're not stretching one more than the other. Because my ribbing has spandex in it, or elastane in it, it's going to stretch a little bit more. So we want to be aware that we're not going to stretch this one out. And then all we're going to do is we're going to sew up here at 5/8 all the way. It's going to go right around the top of the hood. So now we're going to sew the hood. This is the front face of the hood, and we're sewing this at 5/8. I've got those 2 pins in here at the top holding the butterflied center seam down, so we're going to make sure we hit that, and then we're going to go straight down the other side. So this is just a long straight run, and we want to make sure that we do it nice and straight. Again, I'm going to line it in, needle down, and then 2 or 3 stitches backwards. That's your back tack, and then I'm just going to sew right up the front at 5/8. All the way sewn up. Okay, so we're going to work on our next step on our hood. So these are at the moment right sides together. Looks like that. So we're going to flip it right sides out. So we're going to flip it around and pull it right sides out. And then we're going to push the lining inside the hood. So we're going to look like this. Now what we're going to do is we're going to top stitch around the front of the hood. Visually it looks nice, but it's also going to keep the inside hood on the inside and the outside hood on the outside, creating a nice line right here. What we want to do is we want to make sure that where the two fabrics come together, that's right on the end. So we're going to do something a little bit called like rolling your seams. And all that means is that you're just going to wiggle the fabric back and forth between your fingers, sort of like this, until that seam is exposed so you can see it. And I guess the difference is you can see as I just turned it over, it's kind of lumpy here, or it's kind of set in. You want to make sure that the seam comes right to the edge of the surface and it runs right along the front. When in doubt, you want to make sure that it is a little bit on the inside. So if you're going like this, you might want the front to come around and go slightly on the inside, because you definitely don't want to see the lining of the hood on the outside of the hood. So when in doubt, you can go a little bit further and just make sure that when you're looking from one side that you don't see that lining at all from the front, but technically you want it to line up here. So do a thing called rolling your seam. So you're just going to wiggle it back and forth again to pull that seam right to the edge and try and get the seam to be right down the middle. And then again, you're going to pin it in and out of that seam allowance. Okay, so we're really going to hold it into place. This one might take a few more pins and or clips. It doesn't really make any difference on this one. And again, we're called rolling our seams. It just means we're squishing them back and forth. Another way to do this, and we tend to do it with wovens, is you'll press your seams open. So you can take it to the iron and then press the seam flat, and that will push the seam out. But again, our knits don't love the iron as much, so it doesn't work as well. So this works just as easy, and this is more typical of what we would normally do. One of the other things that you can do that we're not doing on this one is if it turns out that you're using really bulky fabric, that your fleece is quite thick or you've used a bigger lineup, right here at the top, there's a lot of seam allowance, right? So there's both the seams that are coming this way, and then of course this way. So you can get like a big chubby bit in here. What you can do is you can go in and cut down some of your seam allowances and cut them down to like 1/4 of an inch. I wouldn't do all of them because you don't want to take away all the bulk. You don't want to be like fat here and then super skinny here and fat here. Plus, if you come too close to the edge, it can make the seam a little bit weak if you don't have enough. But you can definitely clip away some of the bulk so that it's not as fat at that spot. Mine's not too bad. Neither one of my fabrics are particularly thick, so I'm not going to worry about it. But yeah, if you were using a fleece or a polar fleece or your lining was fur, you definitely want to take out some of that bulk. And that could be the same for the seam across the top. So your seam across the top is here. If you had really, really bulky fabric, you might find that you get mine's like a little puckery here, but you might want to take some of that out. And the more fabric you take out, the smoother this is going to be. But again, don't want to take it too small because you don't want to weaken the seam allowance or weaken the seam and have it like unravel on you. But you definitely can, through the curve, take some of the bulk out if you're using thick, heavy fabrics. I'm just going to finish up here. Ouchie! Going back to the clips. I'm going to bleed on my project. You'll know that you've done this right after you've pinned it or clipped it. Give it a little extra look, look at it and make sure. I cannot see the inside lining from the outside, and this was a straight seam, so you're wanting this to look straight. If it's looking all wibbly like this, it means that in some parts you've done it right, your seam has come out, and some parts it hasn't. So you're looking for this to be nice and straight, and that two fabrics are coming together right on the edge, and then you've got it. And we're going to sew this, just so you know, we are not going to sew this right close to the edge. We're going to sew it in about 5/8 or close to 1 inch, and that's just because traditionally that's where the look is, right? It's a wider seam across the top. Oftentimes too, you might have a pull through it, so having the casing there. And if you wanted to, depending on your fabrics, you could do it in 2 spots. You could do a top stitch here at the edge and then do another one 1 inch in. The only thing you want to make sure if you're doing that 1/4 inch right near the edge is that you're not stretching your fabric, because if you come quite close to the edge and you do that top stitch, you might lettuce or stretch it out, and you might find that your hood wobbles back and forth. So that's sort of like a call on your part. But I'm just going to sew this at about 5/8 or 1 inch over. That's just for the aesthetic. The front of the hood, and I'm going to sew it over 1 inch from the edge. So I have a marker on here that's 1 inch. If you don't have a grid plate, then all you have to do is take a ruler and measure from your needle how far over and put a piece of Scotch tape or a marker there. But most have a marking on it. So I'm going in at 1 inch. I'm going to dial this in. Right at 1 inch, same thing, needle down. I'm going to do 2 stitches back to secure my stitches, and then I'm just going to zip. And again, as I said before, this is a completely straight line, so it should be pretty easy to do it. Okay, there. Blammo. There you go. All the way around at 1 inch. We are going to now attach our lovely hood to our body. Here we go. We sewed those sleeves, side seams, so we're going to flip it out, right side out. We are now definitely looking like a hoodie. Boop. Okay, hoodie. So now we're going to attach the hood. So this is, here we go, I'm going to do it. We're like, our hood looks like this. So we are going to be sewing this all the way around, and it's got a curvature to it, as you can see, because my neck and my shoulder has a curvature. We're going to sew it to the bodice. So the way we're going to start is we're doing right sides to right sides, and we're going to start at the very back seam. So those 2 seams are going to line up. If you're having any trouble with this staying together or lining up on you, you could do a stitch along here to hold the 2 pieces together if you're finding that this is being a bit problematic and getting it caught in. Mine seems to sort of stick together because of the fleece, so I'm not having too much trouble with it, but you certainly can. So I'm taking the fleece side, which is the right side, not the lining side, and I'm going to line it up with the center back of my hoodie, which is here, and there's a little clip mark in it that we've made. So I'm going to line that up at the front. we're going to butterfly this inside seam of my hood on both the ribbing side, the lining side, and the outside. So I'm going to open those up, lay them flat, and put them together. And I think what I'm going to do is put a couple of pins in those to make sure that they stay where they're supposed to. Ooh, and one other thing, maybe before we stick it in, we're going to mark the center front of the hood. So I'm going to find the center front. We did mark a clip mark in it before, but we cut it off when we lowered the neck. So you're just going to line up the shoulder seams like this, and then you're just going to run it along and find that center front. I'm going to just put a pin in it so I can know where it is. So there's the center back, and there's the center front, and I'm just going to put a pin in it to mark the center front. Boop, like that. We have the center front marked. We have the center back already marked as our clip. We've taken our hood, and we've butterflied the seam in it. We're going to take this right side here, and we're going to line it up with the clippy part and the back of the hoodie. So right sides together, or fleece to fleece, and we're going to pin it in place. Again, I want to use pins on this because I don't want it to slip at all. I'm trying to sew all 3 of these layers together, and I want all 3 layers to come together at the same spot. I'm going to put a couple pins back there, so that's the back. Now I'm going to go right around and I'm going to put the front on. So what I want is, you see where my stitching is? I want that line of stitching to line up with the center front. So when the 2 hood pieces come together, they're going to be overlapped by about 2 inches. So they're going to line up that line of stitching to the center front. So one's going to come past the center front. So I'm just going to come around on the garment, and I'm going to go past the center front, or where the center front is, and line it up with the line of stitching right here. And I'm going to pin that in place. Okay, so then I'm going back to my center back, and I'm going to pull the hood around the body, so it's coming around the body to the front. I'm going to line up that row of top stitching with the center front, or right on top of the other stitching. It's going to go like that. So there's my center front. I've got that row of stitching lined up there, and I'm going to line up this row of stitching here. And that's going to give us a nice little bit of overlap in the front. Where this overlap is, you want all of the seams or all of the edges of the fabric all to line up. So you don't want any of them pulling away on you. So for any reason any of the fabrics are not lined up here on the edge, you want to make sure that they do. So if you can see this, see how this is kind of pulling back? I don't want it to. I want it to come right to the edge is where it's supposed to be. So that's what I'm saying. If you're having trouble keeping it there, then you might want to, you can stitch it together. So now I'm pinning a little bit around the front of the hoodie on either side like that. And I've got a bunch in the back, making sure those are all lined up nicely. They are. And now I'm going to go around and do this side. So I'm spinning around. So there's my front, there's my back. And I really want to make sure that hood fits on. So there's a little bit on mine, a little bit extra of hood, like it's bowing out a little bit, but it should come together with just ever so little bit of pressure of pulling them apart and lying them flat. And again, I'm trying to get all of those 3 layers of fabric all to line up. And if you've sewn these nicely, if you've done your seam allowances accurately, this should go in quite easily. This should fit in quite nicely, but if you're finding that the hood is way too big for the opening of the neck, you have 2 choices. You can either make the neck opening slightly bigger, but you always want to make sure that the hood pieces are overlapping. If you don't and they only just come together, you're going to see the stitching in the center front, so that's not good. So you always want them overlapping at least, a 1/2 inch, if not a whole inch. But if you're finding that your hood is way too big, you can overlap them a little bit more, and that still looks nice if they're overlapped like 1.5 inches. Or the other thing is you can make your hood smaller. The way that you would make your hood smaller is you would increase the seam allowance at the back seam. So the hood back seam here, you could increase it from like the crown down by like maybe 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch, and that would make the bottom of the hood a little bit smaller to fit it in. So, or I guess the final choice is that you could increase how low the neck sits. So that's another choice, is that you could cut the neck down a little bit if you felt like it was finishing too high. The only thing that you want to do if you're cutting that neck down a little bit is to be very modest in how much you do, because it's going to open it up much more than you think. So if you were going to cut that down, I would start in like 1/4 inch increments, and you'll have to do it with our stencil that we made for the neck opening. You're going to put it on, start it at the shoulder seams, and then you're going to come down at a total of about 1/4 inch to the front. And you can use that stencil as a guide to make that nice and smooth, but don't go and chop it down 1.5 inches, because when you're talking about circumferences, you don't want to make it so that your hood is now not going to meet in the front. So I'm just going to pin the other side. When we sew them together, we're going to sew it with a basting stitch first. A basting stitch is just a really, really long stitch. And the reason I want to do a basting stitch first is that this is a little bit difficult to get on. I find that students often won't get it nice in the front where all those pieces come together because the hood is tugging. Sometimes instead of coming around round, they come around round and then flat, or sometimes the hood pops out of the seam and then it's not in there properly, or it's crooked. And so we want that first go around to be really easy to take out in case we need to. So we're going to baste it in and make sure it looks all perfect. Once we baste it in and it looks all perfect, then we can go around with a regular stitch. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around with a zigzag stitch. So it's going to be all in there. But I really have seen too many times if you use a regular stitch to sew your hood in the first time and it doesn't work out, then you're really fussing around with a lot of hard stitching. So I've pinned it in like this, and when we go sew it on the sewing machine, we're going to take the arm of the sewing machine off and we're going to put it in like this, and we're going to sew around in a circle all the way around. So we've got our hood all pinned on, 1,000,000 pins all the way around. I'm going to take the arm of my sewing machine off. I'm going to put it aside, and I'm going to stitch all the way around. I'm stitching at 5/8. I'm going to start at the center back. So I'm going to stick this on, line it up at 5/8. And I'm going to start around the center back, putting it down. I'm going to increase my stitch length to the biggest stitch length I can, which is a 5 on my machine. I think that's pretty typical. So if you've got a dial, just switch it up. And you don't want to go too fast because you want to make sure that you're getting this on nice and evenly. You've got 3 layers of fabric, in some areas more, and you don't want the one bottom layer buckling up on you. So you're going to make sure. I'm going to put my hand here because I'm trying to make sure it goes through flat, and I'm going to have my other hand here, making sure that there's no other fabrics in place, like getting up underneath it. Okay, so I'm needle down, I'm a couple of stitches backwards. Okay, and then we're just going to, and this is pretty curvy, so you want to make sure that you're hitting all those curves, and that you're not stretching the fabric. So now we're coming up to that center front where all of those fabrics are coming together. I've got 1,000,000 pins in it. I'm going to try my best. It's quite curvy, so I'm going to go a little bit slower and try and make sure that everything is lining up the way I want it to. Remember to keep rotating your fabric as you're rotating around, because you're going in a circle. You don't want this part of your garment to get all twisted up, because then you'll be stretching the fabric. And again, I'm going to overlap this just a tiny little bit and backstitch and up. Okay, so I've gone all the way around. It looks pretty good, I think. I'm going to take the pins out really quickly and flip it over, and then we'll double check and make sure that she looks all good. There is the front. She's looking good. So you'll notice if this had twisted, that this might come out, and you might see the seam here or the edge of the hood there. So it looks pretty good. I'm going to tuck this down. I really wanted this to line up with this. No one's ever going to see it, but that's the idea, that that's lined up there and that it's in snugly and that it's not puckering or it's coming out, right? That it hasn't caught. And then anywhere around to make sure that the fabric hasn't puckered up. So I think she looks really good all the way around. Okay, so now we're going to go back in and pull that neckline up again so I can see it. There we go. And now I'm going to do a zigzag stitch all the way around. And like I did before, I'm trying to get the zigzag to hit right on that line. So I'm going to stick it in and see if I can do that. Again, I'm going to start at the center back. Okay, so we are now going to do a reinforcement stitch all the way around the neck, and we're going to do that with a zigzag stitch. on my machine, I set it at a 5, and I'm going to do a slightly longer stitch than the preset. I just don't, if the stitch is too tight, you can what we call lettuce it, meaning there's so many stitches that it's going to stretch it out. So you want a good size stitch that's going to hold the fabric together, look neat, and that is also the size of the stitch I've done everywhere else. So I also want it to look the same all the way around. And so I'm just putting it on the arm of the machine like this. I am lining it up so that I am doing a 5/8 seam allowance again, and so that when it bounces this side, it's going to hit the stitch line and then go to the other side. And I'm just going to go nicely all the way around. And there we go, zigzag all the way around. Now we're going to do a top stitch, and we're going to top stitch the hood down to the outside. If you wanted a really, really neat neckline, you could trim this off now, but that does make it really difficult to catch the top stitch, so I'm going to leave it. If you got really good and you're a little bit more practiced, you definitely could cut it down to about a 1/2 inch, and then it would make a neater neckline. But I don't want to miss my top stitching while I do it. So now I'm going to turn it right side out. So there's my hood right side out. I'm going to push all of the seam allowances towards the garment, and then just like I had done on the shoulder seam and the arm seam, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do a top stitch all the way around the neck, changing my stitch back to a straight stitch and a slightly elongated straight stitch, and I'm doing my straight stitches at 3.5. Like always, I want to start somewhere where you're not going to see it. So typically in sewing, we start at the very back, because at the one point you're going to have to overlap or come together, and sometimes if that's not perfect, you don't want that right in the front. We want it in the back because most of the time the hood will be down, and so you won't see those starting and stopping stitches. So again, all of the seam allowances are going to push towards the garment, and I am going to stitch less than 1/2 inch away from the seam. When we're sewing this, you can pin it and pin them down that way, or when you're sewing, I'm going to hold my hand under here and make sure all the seam allowance is going down that way. The other thing too is I don't want, again, that fabric to bubble over, so while I'm stitching, I'm going to try and pull those seams apart a little bit. So I'm going to go like this. I'm going to start here. So I'm using this hand to make sure my seam allowances are going the right way, and I'm using this hand to make sure that the fabric is taut as I go around the neck. Pull that hood through. Okay, and there is our top stitch around the neck. Looking pretty good. It'll look even better because you're not going to have the contrasting thread, although the contrasting thread here looks kind of nice. So the inside looks like this now. So again, what I would do is very, very carefully, if this was bothering me at all, to make it tidier, you can now trim that seam allowance down a little bit. Just be ever so careful because you don't want to knit this with your scissors and cut a hole in your garment, right? So there isn't much seam allowance, but you could tidy it up a bit. But again, you're not going to see it at all, and it's not going to feel against your neck because this overlaps in the front. And our last pieces that we're going to put together are our ribbing. So these are our cuffs. There's 2 of them, and that is our waistband, and it's only one piece. It's cut on the fold. And we are going to fold these ones right sides together, just edge to edge like this, edge to edge. So you're making a long tube going like this. And again, we're just going to put some pins in and right along that edge, and we're going to sew down there. So it's going to go like this. That is going to create our cuff. The right side on the ribbing is usually the stripy part of it is more defined. So you want the bigger lumps or the bigger stripes, the bigger ribbing, as it were, to be on the outside. The other way to tell, and you can see if I'm looking at it, is if you stretch the ribbing, and it's easier in darker colors than lighters, but if you stretch the ribbing, you will see, like if you go like this and stretch it, you can actually see the elastic going across, and that's the wrong side. So if you stretch it like this and you see white lines going across, that's the elastane. You don't want to see it. So on the good side, you shouldn't be able to see the elastic. So it's the lumpier side, or the ribbier side is the right side. And there we go. So we're going to pin it like that, and we're going to sew down there at 5/8 and there. This is our waistband. So again, we're going to just take these pins out, and we're just going to turn this into a circle. So we're just going to sew the two ends together. And again, I'm going to flip it around so I've got the right sides together. So that's that thicker rib part. And this is so easy. We're just going to line up those two edges perfectly. Put a couple of pins in, and then we're going to again sew those down at 5/8. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is ribbing. So these are our cuffs, and that's our waistband. I'm going to show you how to do it. It's really simple. I've got the pins in. Again, we're doing a 5/8 seam allowance. We're coming right over to here. I'm just going to lay it in here just like we've done all the way along on all the other pieces. I'm going to line it up with the 5/8. I'm putting my presser foot down. I'm dropping my needle. I'm doing backup stitches till I get to the edge. And then I'm just going to sew all the way down, not stretching the fabric. You can see I'm hardly touching it at all. It's going to go through all by itself, and all I'm trying to do is keep it going straight. Ta-da! Okay, so the last piece we're going to do is our waistband of our ribbing. Again, we've pinned it right sides together down the edge, and we're just going to sew it down here at 5/8. Stick it in, needle down, several stitches backwards, and then we're just going to sew 5/8. Okay, so we got our hood going here. We got pocket on, we got hood part on. Arms are on, and all the last things we got to do is get the ribbing on the ends of the sleeves and at the bottom of the waist. So we're all ready to do that. I have got my bottom ribbing piece. So what I want to do is I want to mark the quarter panel. So I have 4 spots to match up. So I'm just going to pin it right here, just on the fold over here. So that's my halfway around part. And then I'm going to flip it this way. And again, I'm going to find my a quarter mark over here. And I'm just going to put a little pin in it. You can make a mark with your friction pan or whatever you just want a marking, how we're going to line it up. So that goes in just marked on our quarter. We're going to take this piece here and we're going to fold it in half. We are going to fold it wrong sides to wrong sides so that the outside is on both sides. And I'm just going to butterfly that seam there just to make it sit flat. If it doesn't, it's no big deal. But it does make it sit nice. And we're just going to fold that in half. I'm going to line up one of the seams here with the side seam. And we're going to sew this raw edge here to the raw edge at the bottom of the hoodie. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick it on like this. So there's my side seam. There's the seam that I've got. I've butterflied it. I've lined them up. And I'm just going to lay one on top of the other. This hoodie seam here, again, I'm going to butterfly that. Just means to open it up flat, and so the bulk is not either on one side or the other. And I want all 3 edges of the fabric to line up. If you're having troubles getting those 3 lines up, you can take your ribbing and go on the sewing machine and sew right at the or near the edge to hold the 2 pieces together so that you're not trying to manage 3 pieces. But it shouldn't be too difficult to line it up. So we're going to line it up like this. Butterfly those seams, and then we're going to put 2 pins in it, one in either of the seams. So we're just going to go like this. Okay, and that's all the raw edges together. Then I'm going to find that other halfway point that I've already marked with my pin over here, and I'm going to go line that up on the other side. So here's my other side seam. I'm going to put this on like this. So the raw edges are all lining up. This is my fold and my ribbing down here. I'm going to line that up to the halfway point. I'm going to open up the seams of my sweatshirt and I'm going to line it up to that pin. And then I am lining all of those seams up so they're nice and flush with each other. And I'm going to put a couple of pins in right there. Yeah. Okay. Then the next thing I'm going to do is on our sweatshirt, we have marked a little snippet of where the center front is. And we're going to line that up with the center front of this because we've already marked it with our pin. So we're going to come together and we're going to, just make sure that's flat. And we're going to line it up with our center front. So we're going to go in. This time, because the hood is there, you're going to have 4 pieces of fabric. You're going to have your hoodie piece, you're going to have your pocket piece, and then you've got your 2 layers of ribbing. And we're just going to pin those into place. And we're going to repeat the process on the back. So we're going to take the back. And remember, we are pinning to the good side of the fleece, right? So we're going on the outside and we're pinning it to the good side of the fleece, lining up that pin with that little snippy mark. And again, I'm going to put a pin in. So now I've got it marked in 4 spaces. What should happen on your hoodie is that the hood part or the main part, the fleece part, should be bigger than this ribbing part. What we want to do is we want to stretch that ribbing on so that it brings the jacket in a little bit, or the hood in a little bit at the bottom. For this one, because it's a loose fitting jacket, it's only going to bring it in slightly. We don't have it really tight, so it's not going to give you that marshmallow look. It's actually going to hang fairly straight, but it is going to bring the ribbing in slightly at the bottom, okay? So we should be looking at this is a little bit hanging down. So all you're going to do is grab onto your pins and just give it a little tug until the ribbing part is taut against the fleece. So just a little bit of a stretch until it's taut and they fit together like that. And then we're just going to pin it. And now it doesn't really make any difference where you pin it. You just want to make sure that those 2 fabrics are taut and that all 3 layers of fabric are lining up at the edge. They're all coming to the edge. It's not a big stretch, so it just should be a little bit of a stretch. And you definitely don't want to stretch it so you're pinning it so you're stretching both pieces a lot. You're just stretching it enough so that that ribbing piece is long enough to line up or match up with your fleece fabric. So I'm pulling it like that, as you can see. And then the easiest thing to do is just grab onto it wherever your thumbs are, and then you'll know that you can pin it there. You can also have somebody else help you. So somebody else can pull on it so that your ribbing is the same length as your fleece, and then you can pin it in place. Ta-da! So it looks like that. I'm going to complete that same process around the front because I just did the back. So I'm just going to stretch it enough, grab onto it, give it a pin, put it in place. As many pins as you feel comfortable with, at least 1 in each one of these quarter panels, probably 2. And again, making sure all of those layers come to the edge. So there we've got it all pinned on. I'll show you what it looks like. All pinned on is going to look like that. Okay, so now I'm going to do the same thing on the sleeve. I'm bringing the sleeve over. This is the sleeve that we had pinned together. I'm going to find that edge piece first. So I'm going to find the halfway point right there. Now we're going to flip it halfway over. We want those seam allowances on the inside, right? So just the nice is on the outside. And again, if you can butterfly those seams inside there, make them go. Butterfly, it just makes it a little less bulky when we're sewing them on. So we're going to pull those together. So we're going to attach these to the end of the sleeve. Now for the sleeve cuff part, this might be a slightly tighter fit or a bigger tug on your wristband because we need this tight enough so it's going to sit on your wrist and not flop down off of your arm. We're going to take this sleeve like this. There's my seam allowance. We're going to put this around that, like that, and pull the sleeve through. And then we're going to line up the edge of the bottom of the sleeve to the edge of the ribbing, and we're going to open up that seam allowance on the fleece so it's flat. So again, we're going to have 3 layers of fabric. We're going to put it flat, and we're going to put a couple of pins in that. I prefer the pins at this point over the clips just because the clips are a little bit slidier, and as you're stretching the ribbing, you don't want anything to slide. And then our halfway mark on our sleeve is right there, and we're going to pin that on all 3 layers at the end. So you can see this is pretty scoochy, pretty goofy. You're just going to pull it taut with your fingers. Pull it taut until it's tight, until the ribbing is lying flat against your fleece, and you're going to put a pin in it. And the other one, pull it taut. Make sure all of your edges are lined up. Pull taut, lined up, and that's where I'm going to put my pin. flamo. Again, it's going to look like that, but you can see if I pull it taut, the fleece is going to lie flat up against that ribbing. We're going to sew it on, and then it's going to come back together and give you that nice wristband. So halfway mark of this one. Oh, and for fun, on this one I'll show you. We can absolutely mark the halfway around point on that sleeve. So that's there. If that makes it easier, fold this in on itself so that the outside is on the outside and all your seam allowances are on the inside. Open your seam allowance so it is flat, or butterfly it, as we say. It looks like a butterfly. We are now going to slide this onto the end of the sleeve like this, lining up the seam with the seam on the cuff. Butterfly your fleece, lining all the edges up and putting a couple of pins in there. I'm putting 2 pins in here because I'm trying to hold the seam allowances down in place. I don't want them flipping up on me when I go around. These are the final stages of your hoodie. We get this on. Okay, and halfway and halfway is here and here. Ouch. Stretch until that fleece is flat against your ribbing. Hold it with your finger and put your pin in. Pinned on. So we're going to sew the bottom of this on. It's going to need a little bit of stretching as we go along. We're going to do a straight stitch, and we can do a regular straight stitch on this. So I'm going to return my sewing machine to a 2.5 stitch length. We always start at the side or where the seam normally is. We don't want to start in the front or back. It's just very typical. We're going to start here on the side. That means if we make a mistake, then no one will really see it because your arm is going to cover it up. So that's where we want to do our overlap. So we're going to stick it under the sewing machine. I'm going to sew it at 5/8. And this time I am going to be stretching the ribbing just ever so much so that it fits against the fleece and that the fleece is not folding over. I'm going to be holding it down here, giving it a little stretch, and then making sure that it's going through by guiding the fabric by having my hand here. So needle down, a couple of stitches backwards, and here we go. Because I'm stretching the fabric, I definitely want to be really aware that I'm not stopping the sewing machine from sewing, okay? So this hand is helping. I'm only stretching it a little bit. If I'm to stretch on it a lot, what'll happen is that the fabric won't be able to move through the machine, and you'll do lots of tiny stitches or stitch in one place. So we're just giving it enough pressure to make it go flat, and this hand is helping it go through. Beautiful. Couple of stitches back, lock her off. Now I'm going to take my pins out, or you've probably already taken yours out, and we're going to do a zigzag stitch just as we've done on all of the other areas where there's some stretch. I'm going to set it on my machine, which is a 5. I'm going to make it slightly bigger. Okay, and then again, I'm going to go and I'm going to make the zigzag stitch just on the lower half below the line of stitching, and I'm going to run it at 5/8 so that my stitch just hits that line, or as close to it as I can get it. Oh, and one last tip. You don't want to come on this side of the line no matter what. Not even one time, because what will happen is you'll flip it over and you'll see that one stitch, it'll poke over. So you're better to get further away from it and up to it, but you don't want to go on the other side of it. So that's an absolute no-no. And there I go all the way around. Just like we did before. And you can see, I think as we flip it over now to the right side, that your ribbing should like hang in. And that's a bit hard to see, but it's going to hang in. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do a top stitch, which is just, you don't even have to do it. The reason we do it is because it looks pretty. But if you're too nervous or you don't want to, there's no reason that you can't finish the bottom of your sweatshirt like this. But we are going to go ahead and do the decorative top stitch so that it goes all the way around and holds that upper part up. So again, all the seam allowances are going that way against the garment. We're not sewing on the ribbing. We're sewing on the sweatshirt side. We're going to set our stitch to a straight stitch. And again, I'm setting mine at 3.5 instead of 2.5. Sitting it in that machine, I'm going to again do, you can pin it, right? So you can force the seam allowance to go up towards the garment, and then you can pin that seam allowance so it stays up. When I'm sewing it, I'm just going to have my hand here, and I'm going to be using my hand to make sure that the seam allowance is going that way. I don't have to stretch it this time at all because this is the part that was stretched, this is flat. But I do want to make sure that the fabric is slightly taut as it goes through and that the sweatshirt fabric is not rolling down over the ribbing part. And again, we're doing that same measurement as we did on all the top stitch. The more consistent you can get with that, the better. This is really fat here. This is going through a layer of sweatshirt, a layer of pocket, and 2 layers of ribbing. No, that's wrong. 2 layers of pocket and 2 layers of sweatshirt and 2 layers of ribbing. So I guess we're going through 6 layers of fabric here, and so it's very thick. So how did I do? You know what I did do? I sewed it pretty nice on the front. I think I got my top stitching pretty even on the front, but I think on the back I was a little bit wibbly. Oh, not too bad. Slightly smaller. Nobody's perfect. Okay, now we're just gonna put those sleeves on. Next thing. So here's our sleeve. This one is a little bit trickier. As you can see, it's pretty scrunchied in there. This is slow going. So we're just gonna go really slow. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna open this up like so. You're gonna find that seam that looks like this. We're gonna lay this under the presser foot at 5/8 and we're gonna stretch it and move it around as we go. And it's just plain old tricky. Okay, that's it. On this one, once you go over the pin, if you're gonna take your pins out, you definitely wanna take them out, you know, as you go or just after you've gone over them, because as they rotate around, they can get in the way after you've even sewn them. So as I said, this is slow going. So I'm going to stick it in like this.
Your stitch length.
Oh, yeah. Stick it in like that and line it up with the 5/8. I'm just remembering I got to get this back down to 2.5. So there's my regular stitch length. Find my presser, find my gas pedal. Okay, so I'm going to hold it at the first pin until the fabric is taut, and I'm going to hold the rest of the cuff out of the way, and we're just going to go through. So needle down, a couple of stitches backwards to lock me in, holding on to that first pin, pulling it fairly taut, and just going nice and slowly until I sort of get to my fingers. Okay, I'm going to stop. I'm going to take those back pins out, because when they come around, they're going to bother me. Okay, and then I'm going to twirl this around, hold on to the next pin. I'm going to pull it taut and make sure those 3 edges are lined up. Pull it taut. Use this hand to push away the cuff so it's not in my way. Lining it up at 5/8 and then sending her through till I get to my fingers. Not too close. You don't want to run over your fingers. Stop again. I'm going to go back and take that pin that was way back there out so it doesn't bother me as it comes back around. Hold on to my next pin, pull the fabric nice and taut, make sure my 3 edges are lined up right there, that I'm at 5/8, and send it through again. This hand is pushing it a little because this hand is pulling it a little bit to make sure it's taut. So you're kind of wanting to make sure that if you just pull it this way, you may find that your feed dogs are not going to be able to pull it through. Take that back pin out. Make sure my edges are all lined up, that everybody is nice and taut. I'm not pulling or stretching the sweatshirt fabric. Oh, one more thing. If your sewing machine, when you stop sewing, doesn't drop the needle into your fabric, as soon as you stop sewing, make sure that you put your needle down into the fabric, because once you rearrange your fabric or give a tug on it, you don't want the fabric to slide out of place. So as you're doing all of this mucking about, trying to get it all straight, make sure that your needle is in the fabric, because if it's up and you pull on it, it's just going to come flying out. Okay, so down again we go. Not stretching the sweatshirt fabric, but stretching that ribbing at 5/8. And again. back at the seam, my 2 backup stitches. Okay, so it looks beautiful like that all the way around. We're going to do the zigzag now, the same as we did. I'm just going to flip it over just to show you what it looks like. Looks beautiful. There's no puckers in this fabric. And the cuff is taut enough to hold it onto your wrist while the sweatshirt is big enough. So I'm just going to open it back up just to where we were, exactly what we did before. And I'm going to sit it, in here like this. Switch to my zigzag. 5. There we go. And in, and just go around and give her that reinforcement of the zigzag stitch. Okay, so a couple of things. You can top stitch this like we've done the other ones, but it is really difficult to do, to top stitch it here. So I am going to say that we don't top stitch it here with our students. If you want to try that and you can get it on there, that's totally great. And the other thing is, on this one here, we do have the seam allowance. If you wanted to, if it's bugging you around your wrist, again, on this one, you could trim it off. This is the one that's tight around your wrist, so sometimes students don't like this flippy bit of the seam allowance, so you can definitely trim that down a bit. Remember, do not catch that side or you'll be crying because you have a big hole right there. I think that is it. Oh, I have another one I will show you when we do the other one. So one last thing is that some students will be asking, why can't we put this on the arm of your sewing machine like that and sew it around like that? The thing is, you definitely could if your armhole was big enough. But the thing is that you don't want to be sewing, you don't want to be stretching the fleece out when you sew. If you put it on there and you stretch it out, so you're stretching both the fleece and the ribbing, it will stretch out the fabric and you'll get a really baggy cuff. So you don't want to be stretching out the sweatshirt fabric. So if your arm here happens to be really little, you totally could put it on like that and sew it that way. But for most cuffs, it's too big. The arm is too big. So again, I'm just going to send this in. I'm going on a one, and I'm going in.
I'm going to stop the video. I don't need all that. Go ahead.
Okay, so we have finished our hoodie. Once you get it back onto your table, you're finished. You might have some little extra threads. You're going to trim all of those off really, really carefully. And then you have your great looking hoodie. Looks so smart. There we go. finished. So it should take a couple of hours to make, maybe a little bit more if you're being really careful. It's a nice loose fitting hoodie, but it also comes in customizable sizes as well as I think 12 original sizes. So you can make it the way you'd like it to make and wear it the way that you want it to fit, whether you want it super oversized and drop shouldered or a little bit snugger fitting. We have all of those patterns. We carry all of the fabric in the studio that you would need to make it. I think there's 8 or 10 different colors and 2 different weights of sweatshirt, both a terry back and a fleece back sweatshirt fabric. You can buy the pattern at La Movida on our shop site. So just go to www.lamovida.ca and go to the shop site, and the patterns are available there. And as many times as you want, you can go and watch the tutorial and just watch me over and over and over again making a sweatshirt. Also on our YouTube page, we have the tutorial on how to make our sling bag. And so you can watch that one, follow along, or as well find the pattern and make the tote tutorial. We'll have another pattern coming up in another couple of months, so just keep watching out for it. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram, like us on Facebook, and to go to our YouTube page or the website. And we're always here at La Movida for in-house lessons. We teach this particular project in our level 1 sewing class. So if you want to sign up for level 1 sewing class and come and hang out with us and make the sweatshirt, that's also totally doable.